Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio, and this is your host, Webster Tarpley, speaking from Washington, D.C. The first item, topic A, another important victory for the Tax Wall Street Party in our agitation to catalyze governments, political forces worldwide to crush and destroy ISIS, Daesh, ISIL, Islamic State, Caliphate, anything you want to call it, to crush that terror cult, to crush that genocidal cult, and to make that the beginning of the end of terrorism in our time. There was a time when terrorism, say the 1950s or 60s, meant that some lunatic was going to put a bomb in the New York subway and kill 2 or 3 people, and that was hyped a lot, right? The mad bomber, George Metesky, and how he got all his stuff done. That was a big deal in the 1950s, but this was essentially trivial. We've got to put terrorism back into that same trivial pocket, because, as I pointed out in my book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror, which I will refer to several times today, terrorism is the means of the oligarchy to wage war on the people. And when I say people, I mean the popolo in Machiavelli's sense, the middle class. In other words, the majority of most of us. So here is what we have been able to achieve. I say we've probably got one big success and one media success to report. So here's our report on what we've been able to do. First of all, as you know, and some of you have told me that you've got it coming out of your ears, you'll see why. We have been talking about the 100-kilometer corridor starting at the Euphrates River on the border between Turkey and Syria. You start on the western side, that's the city of Jarablus. You go 100 kilometers to the west, and you come up in a place which is essentially the end of it, right? And we're talking about the gaps between 2 Kurdish-controlled areas. And this is the Jarablus corridor. The Kurds control everything from the Euphrates all the way to the point where Turkey, Syria, and Iraq come together, right? That 3-country corner. So this 100-kilometer, 60-mile corridor is the aorta of ISIS. Any competent military person, look at that for 2 seconds. You say the way to destroy this formation, as with any formation, is to cut their supply line, destroy their logistics. So get busy and do that. So now we have, and we have been talking about this since the 28th of July. You can go back and look at our briefing, and we'll revisit this again, too. And with special emphasis, we have been talking about it lately. This was the theme of my speech, my interview to the Friedberg conference in Germany on October 31st and November 1st. I was on November 1st. You can find that in German on my website. We also mentioned this in our special November 14th speech, which we taped in English and French. This is also mentioned in there, that this is the way to knock out the terrorists. So we've been hearing rumblings about this. The big news then came on a Thursday, yesterday. The first I learned of it was on MSNBC with Kirsten Welker reporting from the driveway of the White House, saying that there had just been one of those important briefings off the record, in other words, delivered by a senior U.S. official, otherwise unnamed. The people who went to it are not allowed to say who said all these things. I would guess Susan Rice, whose name I pronounce with a shudder, but gold is where you find it, and Robert Malley would be another possibility, or maybe more than one. So what was the content of this briefing? So this is what's in the the Washington Post today, and that is the following. The senior government official, U.S. government official at the White House, described significant progress in degrading core ISIL, core ISIS, core Daesh in Iraq and Syria with air attacks and pending ground assaults. So now we're being promised not only air attacks on ISIS, which these people have failed largely to deliver, and pending ground assaults. Hopefully Kurds, helped along by U.S. Special Forces. Pending ground assaults on locations the officials said were carefully chosen for their strategic value to the Islamic State. That's good. No more tactical frittering away of resources. Go for something strategic. Change the entire picture. Islamic State, also known as ISIL and ISIS. Chief among these strategic targets, chief among these is the last remaining 60 miles of Islamic State control territory along the Turkish border in northwest Syria. I got to read that again. Chief among these locations of strategic value is the last remaining 60 miles of Islamic State-controlled territory along the Turkish border in northwest Syria. You heard that here first. We've been the ones campaigning. We've been hammering on this theme for the past 2 months, and indeed going back 4 months in a general way. The area remains a key entry point for what the officials said are about 30,000 foreign fighters from at least 100 countries who have joined the Islamic State. Closure of the area has been long anticipated, but delayed in part due to disagreements with Turkey about how to do it. Now, we have to add immediately, these are not honest disagreements with Turkey. This is the treachery of the Erdogan clique. Erdogan, Davutoglu, the Neo-Ottoman Party, full of treachery. It stands to reason, right? If the Saudis are trying to preserve a medieval monarchy and they use a terrorist militia, right, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, then, not surprising, that Turkey would do something similar and try to use the same groups, and they're actually cooperating in this up to a certain point. We've also got to point out that this has been, it's been under debate. The U.S. has been promising it. We've heard Secretary of State Kerry promise Fareed Zakaria that something would happen with this soon. We heard on NPR some weeks ago that there was a wonderful Turkish one-star general, a brigadier general on the Turkish side who was in the process of trying to interfere with the traffic. Now, we don't believe any of that. But what's important here is the Obama White House has now made a commitment before the American people and in the eyes of the world to do something about those 60 miles, those lousy 100 kilometers of royal road for terrorism, right? El Camino Real of the terrorists. There it is. Interdict it, close it, shut it down, block it, and ISIS withers on the vine. Now, it's also true. There's another area in the northwest, right? Further to the west of what I've been talking about, there is a secondary supply line. I would call it it's a supply line. It's coming from the Hayat excrescence, the Hayat parrot's beak of Turkey, right, which we talked about when the Turks shot down the Russian aircraft, right, over the southern extremity of that Hayat parrot's beak formation. There, of course, there's the M4 highway, I believe, which comes in there, which the Russian bombing and the activity of the Syrian Arab Army are helping to shut down. That's another one. But the main one is Jarablus. So Jarablus must be struck. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We are getting ready for St. Nicholas Day here, December 6th. That's Sunday. And that reminds us that Turkey is the land of St. Nicholas, and that Erdogan is oppressing precisely these communities. I think he lived in the current city of Demra. So this stuff with Erdogan, this is just no good, right? This is very oppressive and very treacherous, and the U.S. has to do something. We got to stop covering for this monster. And when we've got people from Geraldo Rivera to the New York Times op-ed page to many, many others who are saying we're sick and tired of the treachery of Erdogan and Davutoglu, and these guys have to go. And if it has, I would say personally, I would not be surprised by a military coup if the U.S. did anything serious. One thing we could do, the Russians have now imposed sanctions on Turkey because they shot down this airplane. That was an act of banditry by the Turks. That was a pre-planned ambush that was calculated, and that's all designed to get the U.S. embroiled, right? Erdogan wants to fight to the last American. Well, the answer is no. Rather, what we ought to do is to join the Russian sanctions, promote that in the Security Council. Say, look, the world is going to boycott Erdogan because there is a worldwide consensus that ISIS must go, and the secret caliph of ISIS is, of course, Erdogan. By the way, some broadcasters around the world, RT, for example, are catching up on the fact that Erdogan's son, Bilal, is one of the kingpins of the smuggling of oil. I welcome the comments of the Russian defense minister this past week, or one of the top commanders, right, nailing the Erdogan family for that oil smuggling, right, that the family business of the Erdogan crime family is indeed ISIS, including the oil. Now, today and yesterday, RT is going with the idea that there are hospitals in southern Turkey which are exclusively for terrorists. That's good, but we've known that for months. Check the... if you want to do a word search, I think it's easy to do on Tarpley.net. So you go to Tarpley.net and you put in some of that stuff about Erdogan, oil, Turkey, and you'll find that Bilal, his son, is involved. But the thing that they're not telling us so far is that Erdogan's daughter is the Florence Nightingale, the head nurse, right, the manager of this facility for wounded terrorists, right? She's the Clara Barton of the terrorists in Turkey and in Syria. Okay, so the main idea coming out of the White House briefing is that they want to cut the ISIS-Daesh supply line coming through the Jarablus corridor, 100 kilometers, 60 miles from west of the Euphrates towards the town of Kilis, K-I-L-I-S, is where they put the beginning of the far western Kurdish control. So this is, I think, an important turning point in current world history. And I must say, if you know somebody or some political force that has been agitating for precisely this, I'd like to know it. Tell me who did it, because we've been doing this now in a general way since the end of July, and specifically the entire month of November, starting with that speech I made in Friedberg, Germany, the Querdenken conference, right? So that we were 1 month ahead of what was going to happen. And I would also urge you to look at this as an object lesson in what can be done. There is no reason to sit here, to feel impotent, to feel like the political process is passing you by, or anything like that. This is all wrong. Very modest forces, provided they are animated and guided by the right strategy and the proper ruthlessness, determination, consistency, and the idea that you will not give up, can do tremendous things. And if we had 100,000 people on this campaign, I'm sure ISIS would be a smoldering wreck, a thing of the past. And the other thing I would point out, as we wrote about in today's briefing, and of course everybody should subscribe to the Tax Wall Street Party daily briefing. You can do that at twsp.us, TWSP-US. It's the acronym of Tax Wall Street Party. You can also go to Tarpley.net. Get yourself a subscription to that daily briefing, because this thing has been 4 months ahead, 1 month ahead, days and days ahead on other events, but generally ahead on the really big issues that are determining the course of world history in our time. So take heart. Realize that many things are possible, even though the outlook may be bleak, even though the forces may be modest and the means are seemingly inadequate. Much can be done, and we have to become accustomed to doing much with little. But now, we cannot, of course, trust the Obama White House. If this was Susan Rice, you can see, again, I pronounce her name with a shudder. We can't trust these people to do anything. Also because their idea that is to oblige the Turkish government to carry this out, that will not do. You're going to have to work with the Kurds. You're going to have to massively arm the Kurds. You're going to have to give them air support. And on the other side, hopefully, Russia will see her way clear to supporting the Syrian Arab army in cutting that same corridor. Because I must say, the fact that the corridor remains open is an argument for the fact that neither the Syrian Russian side nor the U.S. coalition and Kurdish side, neither one has done what is necessary. So I'm here as nobody's groupie to say to Moscow and to Washington, get busy on the Jarablus corridor. There's no reason for waiting. How many weeks and months have to go by? How many useless dead? And if you're Germany, I would also call on you saying, if you want to solve your refugee problem, well then, close the Jarablus corridor and the problem, this huge wave of immigration with all the social dislocations and overwhelming of the humanitarian facilities that has been going on, that will be cut down to size. That will become manageable. And this is the most humanitarian thing we can do, because it is from ISIS that these people are running. As long as it was, these other groups, the huge refugee wave did not materialize. It is ISIS and their extreme mass murder genocide policies. That's what people are actually running from. Now, the thing that I've just said, the Thursday afternoon briefing, again, catalyzed by us, energized by us, had been preceded by some other leaks. And we'll get to those in just a second when we return on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. The critical moment was Thursday afternoon when some high White House official, administration official, came out and addressed pretty much the entire White House press corps. I know I've been in these things. I can remember getting such a briefing off the record, say, during the Reagan administration from the then director of the National Security Council. So you're not allowed to say who it is, but I can speculate who it is, right? We're free to do that. The key idea, chief among the locations that will be hit with air attacks and pending ground assaults because of their strategic value to the Islamic State, Daesh. Chief among these is the last remaining 60 miles of Islamic State-controlled territory along the Turkish border in northwest Syria. Okay, so that's what we heard on Thursday afternoon. Now, several days earlier, we got a precursor of this, right? The ground was being prepared, right, with a ballon d'essai, a trial balloon. And here we read the following. This is based on material in the Wall Street Journal. The United States has urged Turkey to close a stretch of its border running 100 kilometers alongside Syria, which has been used extensively by the Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, to move its foreign fighters in and out of the war-torn country. And, of course, all logistics, things like food, ammunition, spare parts, gasoline, all this stuff, other specialty products. The army travels on its stomach. Never forget it. Napoleon was right. So it has been estimated that around 30,000 Turkish troops would be required to shut down that stretch of border. Well, that's easy. Turkey, last time I looked, and I visited the defense minister, Yavuz Turk, in his fortified office back in what was it, 1987, 1988. Turkey has about 500,000 troops. It's one of the largest armies in the world. So they can easily spare 30,000 to shut down. Essentially, it means to suppress smuggling. Now, back to this quote. This is now a leak from a U.S. official. Quote, "The game has changed. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. The border needs to be sealed," a senior U.S. government official told the Wall Street Journal. Now, quote again, "This is an international threat, and it's all coming out of Syria, and it's coming through Turkish territory." Close quote. The U.S. wants the border between the western Turkish town of Kilis and the eastern Syrian town of Jarablus closed. This is another way to define the two extremities of the corridor. It also wants Ankara to keep a close watch on the border between Jarablus and Kobane. They spell Kobane in a different way, but it's Kobane, from where the IS sends most of its weapons and foreign fighters into Syria. Well, of course, that's what the Kurds have been doing. That's why the Kurds fought for Kobane, and that is why they also fought for Tel Abyad, I think it was, during the summer. And that set up the current situation. It was when that situation materialized that Erdogan sprang into action to try to muddy the waters and save ISIS, which is his baby, or it's Petraeus's baby, but Erdogan is the governess, I guess. According to the London Independent, and this is stuff that people here have been hearing for years now, Turkey has been criticized for its long-term tolerance of and possible complicity with terror groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham, Sham meaning Syria. Moreover, it is reported that Turkey is allowing ISIS, Daesh, to sell crude oil from its captured oil field in Syria, giving the group much-needed revenue to finance its worldwide terror operations. Even on NPR, Diane Rehm this morning, the representative of the Financial Times, with his distinctive oily voice, you can't miss him. He's sort of the Everett Dirksen school of rhetoric. He was saying, well, the Russians are making these accusations, and of course there is something to it. That there is some pretty good evidence that this is what is going on. All right, so you can see this quote here, the earlier one, is even more specific, right? The 100 kilometers, and they're telling you exactly where, from Kilis in Turkey to Jarablus on the Euphrates, I guess on the Syrian side. So the pressure is mounting. Now, of course, as I said, there are follow-up measures that have to be taken, right? We have been asking for a long time for Ashton Carter to be fired. I'll give you more reasons for that in a minute, right? We successfully got rid of ISIS Czar John Allen. We've now got to push this Dr. Strangelove, Ashton Carter, the pedantic utopian lunatic, out of the way. Because of his provocations in the past couple of days. Obama needs to issue an ultimatum. It can be private. That's okay. But he's got to do it. Issue an ultimatum to Turkey saying your support, your collusion, your logistical services, your supply line services to Daesh, ISIS is intolerable. And therefore, you've got to cease and desist. And if you don't do that, we are going to take measures of our own. And don't get in our way, right? The Turks love to put out these things where they say, oh, you can't, nobody tells us what to do when it turns out to be our border, right? We don't ask anybody's permission when it comes to supporting terrorism in northern Syria. I'm sorry, this must end. If you want to do something elegantly, as I said before, Obama could say, I'm also putting economic sanctions on Turkey. I would say at that point, Erdogan would be overthrown by a military coup in about 24 to 48 hours, and all the better for it. Let's not fetishize formal democracy. We can see that Erdogan puts all the journalists in jail. He runs vote fraud. He does all this stuff. That's no democracy. That's a sham. So let's not be fooled and duped by that. The other question then is, what should we do? I call upon all persons of goodwill and worldwide. I call upon all persons of goodwill worldwide to join the Tax Wall Street Party in our mobilization to get this policy implemented. And implemented whether Erdogan likes it or not. And he's not going to like it, so we better get ready to implement it, knowing that Erdogan will try to sabotage it at every turn. There's a point where the weakness and fecklessness of Obama become a national menace. Obama needs to be criticized, not because he has said no to military adventures. We welcome Obama's rejection of military adventures coming from neocon fascist madmen, neocon fascist generals, Petraeus and Allen. But this weakness in regard to somebody like Erdogan, it's now time for this to end. Now, if it doesn't, let's look at this. On the one side, supposing we get what we're asking for, one effect of closing the Jarablus corridor is you would essentially you would pocket a large part of the jihadis in the world. In other words, this patsy milieu, this group of foreign fighters, mercenaries, Freikorps, right, militias, people like this, they started off back in Afghanistan in the 80s, a lot of them. They were deployed in various places in the 90s. And, of course, they fought in Libya, and then they were shipped by the U.S. into Turkey. They could be pocketed. And at that point, maybe that would be the end of it for a lot of them. Maybe that's what they would want. But that would then mean that the number of terrorists in the world would be radically reduced. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. We have to push ahead. We have a very full program. Now, assuming that what we want is not done, we can also see where this is headed. The United States is going to pay a terrible price for the treachery of ISIS czar Allen, Dr. Strangelove, Ashton Carter, and the rest of these people, all the way down to Colonel Steve, what's his name over there, the spokesperson, Colonel Steve Watson, have to remember him. They're all lying and obfuscating and covering up, and this we have to assume is the Petraeus-Allen network, right? The coterie, camarilla of insubordinate generals who fight Obama tooth and nail, right? Because they want him to be an aggressor. They also want everything to fail. They want the air campaign to fail. They want everything to fail so that they can get the 200,000 troops, which is actually what they've always wanted. Now, this woman, Liz Sly, right, Middle East correspondent for the Washington Post, did a very interesting piece. And this is how the U.S. is seen in Iraq, in regard to ISIS. And here we read from Baiji, Iraq. On the front lines of the battle against the Islamic State, suspicion of the United States runs deep. Iraqi fighters say they have all seen the videos purporting to show U.S. helicopters airdropping weapons to the militants, and many claim they have friends and relatives who have witnessed similar instances of collusion. Ordinary people have seen the videos, heard the stories, reached the same conclusion. It might seem absurd to Americans, well, not to this American, but it is widely believed among Iraqis that the United States is supporting the Islamic State for a variety of pernicious reasons that have to do with asserting U.S. control over Iraq, the wider Middle East, and perhaps the oil. There is no doubt, says a Shiite militia commander, right? Interesting what he says. The Shiite commander says, the Islamic State is, quote, almost finished. They are weak. If only America would stop supporting them, we could defeat them in days. End of the quote. How about that? Listen to Allen. Listen to Petraeus. Listen to Ashton Carter, right? Oh, it's going to take 20 years. Oh, it's going to take 5 years here. They're 20 feet tall. I think Obama tried to refute that about the 20 feet tall. They have magical powers. But here's a guy on the ground who's been fighting them the Shiite, and he says, look, they're almost finished. If we could cut the U.S. support, they'd be done. So, elsewhere in this article, we read, the Americans, says one of them, they don't really actively support. Well, maybe they do. But he says that the principal thing is the U.S. is so slow that people believe they're supporting Daesh. And what does that mean? That is the essence of the Allen phony war appeasement of terrorism. So the U.S. has run some strikes, but it hasn't added up. Oh, Colonel Steve Warren, the resident provocateur there, says, this is beyond ridiculous. There's clearly no one in the West who buys it. Well, stop right there, Colonel. I'm in the West and I buy it. So that's baloney. It's beyond ridiculous, says Colonel Steve Warren, the spokesman of the U.S. operation in Iraq. There's no one in the West who buys it. But unfortunately, there's something that a segment of the Iraqi population believes. And now they say this is the Iranian propaganda machine, the Iranians and the Iranian-backed Shia militias. Well, I'm sorry. I see the Jarablus corridor open. You could interdict it. You haven't done it. The Tax Wall Street Party begs to differ with Colonel Stevens. We'd be happy to debate him because we have evidence. It's not crazy. The other explanation offered in this article is that the Iraqis are racist because they hate the U.S., right? They have resentments about what the U.S. did to them, and I think that's, that might seem to be with some justification, but that's not the issue. There's plenty of empirical evidence. Nobody is clear. And here we have a guy, Kirk Sowell, an analyst based in Jordan, about whom I know little. He writes Inside Iraqi Politics, and he says, what influence can we have if they think we're supporting the terrorists? There's a good question for the Pentagon. Now, you've always got to remember, as I constantly stress, that the U.S. government is highly factionalized. Neocon bandits over here, Obama over here. You've got humanitarian bombers with Samantha Power and all these people. Here's one of the things I was considering. Now, this is a kind of a wild hypothesis, but do we remember, for example, when ISIS came into Iraq and the Iraqi forces melted away? My thesis then and now is that was because the Saudis had bribed the officers. The U.S. had bribed the Iraqi officers to run away back in 2003, and the Saudis then bribed them last year. The Saudis are in the business of bribery. How about that the Saudis are bribing U.S. commanders or factions inside the military? Have you never heard of that before? Well, there's a very influential, kind of landmark novel from the middle point of the 20th century. It's called Catch-22. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller is about a guy by the name of Yossarian, but you got an anti-hero in there who is Milo Minderbinder. And Milo Minderbinder is theoretically part of the U.S. Army Air Force in North Africa and Italy and places like this. And he creates a syndicate called M&M Enterprises. And he's all around the Mediterranean. He's buying things on the black market, always cigarettes, tobacco. He does, all kinds of deals, right? It's kind of like Trump. But at a certain point, Minderbinder says, well, I'm going to actually I'm going to do contract missions for the Germans, for the supposed enemy. And at the Battle of Orvieto, Milo Minderbinder in the novel fights on both sides. He bombs his own squadron at the airfield at Pianosa in that central Italian area. He orders his fleet to attack the American base where he himself lives, killing many American officers and enlisted men. Then he gets court-martials for treason, but he's so rich a lawyer gets him off, saying that he expresses the essence of capitalism. So look, it is not unheard of. You can look at the Chinese People's Liberation Army, same kind of thing. You can have a criminal enterprise, a criminal syndicate that operates inside an occupying army. I had a dear friend here, a lady who had been in General MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo in the late 1940s, right? This was SCAP. And she said people in SCAP were relatively clean, but the word in SCAP was that the SACEUR, the U.S. command in Europe, was corrupt and based on thievery. Well, that would be Milo Minderbinder. So I'm wondering whether Milo Minderbinder is commanding any of those units over there, and maybe they're doing it on the side, bribed by the Saudis. Or, if that's not the case, quite possible, I want to know how far up does that go. I want to know who is ordering these deliveries, because as the think tanker says, you'll never get anywhere if people really think that you're supporting terrorists behind their back. All right, so now, on the ground, Hollande has flown to the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier. Germany is coming in with small forces and a humanitarian mission. The British have now voted to come in. People have noted the feckless and rather pathetic performance of Corbyn as the new leader of Labour, compared to Miliband, who was able to stop the damn thing in its tracks back in September of 2013. Corbyn seems to be a rather ineffective, lackadaisical leader. Corbyn, if you really believe war is bad, why didn't you force people to toe the line and impose factional discipline with your whips, right? The famous whips. Why weren't the whips in action? We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Very full plate. Got to keep moving along. Now, the other thing, if you take a look at Tarpley.net as of Saturday, the 5th of December, you're probably going to see this interview I did on a Thursday with Press TV. And it had to do with the Iraqi Prime Minister Abadi saying twice this week that he doesn't want U.S. forces, or more, he doesn't want U.S. forces to be dictated from Washington. He wants that to be bilateral. In other words, no unilateral diktat of who's going to be sent to Iraq. That's got to be negotiated, right? Sovereignty. And he's absolutely right. Now, this comes in response to this Ashton Carter, right, who should be fired, the Strangelove. He was at the House Armed Services Committee earlier this week, and he announced that he's sending 200 U.S. forces to northern Iraq. Now, when I saw that, I said to myself, has he cleared that with Obama, or is he just off the reservation, making it up as he goes along? This question has not been answered. But certainly, Carter, you could see from the way he did it with the lurid detail that he was out to embarrass Abadi. He was trying to provoke something, make trouble, wreck the operation, because Carter is one of those people who wants it to fail so that he can carry out his lunatic notion of a no-fly zone and a safe haven for terrorists in northern Syria, cooperating with Turkey rather than cooperating with the Kurds, Russia, and the Syrian Arab army, which would be the rational policy. And then, after Abadi had already said no, this Colonel Steve Watson, who seems to be also part of this faction, put him down as one of the Camarilla. Steve Watson says, we're going to bring in 200 people. And then Abadi says no again. So I see provocateurs in action. I see insubordination. I see practically treason with these guys. They're trying to provoke Abadi. They're trying to embarrass Abadi, as the Washington Post pointed out. Abadi's in trouble because the U.S. is not doing anything to stop ISIS, as we just heard. So that translates into a political threat to Abadi. Do Petraeus and Allen want Abadi out? They may. Now, here's the other question that we've got all of this going on, and it's time to fire Ashton Carter. That's it. Strangelove out. We had one going before. Hashtag fire Allen B4WW3. We'll be using that again in the coming days. So I guess that is some overview. one other. I'm sorry. This is important, too. Back on July 28th, we published an epoch-making map of Turkey and Syria. We showed the Jarablus Gap. We showed the areas controlled by the Kurds. We showed the Jarablus Gap. We showed the ISIS supply lines coming through there. And that map has gone around the world quite a few times. Now, this past week, RT usefully in itself presented the Virginia state senator, Senator Richard Black from Ashburn in Northern Virginia. He had wanted to run against Congressman Frank Wolf's successor, or he wanted to compete for that. He was forced out because of some unfortunate statements. We'll leave that aside. But Senator Black came up there and showed you a map which was conceptually identical and graphically almost identical to our map. But the problem is we had our map on July 28th, and now Senator Black had his 2 days ago. So, RT, we are now 4 months ahead of you. What is wrong over there? Why don't you show these things when they become news rather than when they fit into some preconceived ideological notion, right? Let's provide the service to world public opinion of actually telling the truth in a timely way. Now, we got to talk about the San Bernardino now, because this is now part of the war hysteria. On NPR this morning, we had another confirmation that these events were taking place in the middle of a drill. Here we go. On the day of the mass shooting in San Bernardino, California, the city's SWAT team was training for an active shooter situation just minutes away from the scene of the massacre. This is National Public Radio this morning, Martin Caste, Kaste. And this is like some things I have in my 9/11 synthetic terror. They say, we were just working through scenarios when this call went out, says Lieutenant Travis Walker, the SWAT team commander. So they go seamlessly from the drill into the actual event. We had just finished a training scenario that involved multiple shooters at multiple locations within a small confined area. And then they were off. They didn't get time to change from drill to the actual operation. Now, this had been already revealed here in a publication called the Victor Valley News, Victor Valley, California, VVC. So Victor Valley College alerts public to upcoming, quote, active shooter, close quote, training. So this is November 27th, already last week. So Victor Valley College officials would like to inform students and area residents that there will be an active shooter training exercise on the Victor Valley College campus on Monday, November 30th. And there will be significant police presence, and part of the campus will be on lockdown. Hey, you're paying tuition to them, you better sue them for this kind of hanky-panky. The Tax Wall Street Party has been calling for the cancellation of all of these so-called domestic security drills with police in military uniforms, tanks with bazookas, and all the rest of it. This is simply crazy. So what do we have? It looks like we've got the classic pattern of the drill goes live. Tell me where I'm wrong. And that seems to be what somebody wanted to happen. Now, it's highly relevant because we have the two patsies, and I'm calling them patsies. We know about them now. The two people are involved here, and the question is, they have an armory in their basement, a stockpile of explosives and ammunition, 14 dead, 21 wounded. And so we've got these two people who seem to be completely normal. In other words, if you look at this from the categories of normal everyday life, we would have to say Syed Rizwan Farouk, right? Farouk, I guess it's like King Farouk, but not quite. Farouk, 28, and Tashfeen Malik from Pakistan, the Farouk born in the U.S. What were they doing? Well, did they think they were actors in a drill? Did they think they were surveillance role players? Did they think that, doing these things, having these guns, was simply part of play acting so that you'd have props that would be used, or maybe if somebody wanted to train going into a safe house of terrorists, then you'd find these guns, you could actually do that, and it would be very realistic. All of that, I think, is quite plausible. Remember Mohammed Atta? There was everything about Mohammed Atta, the so-called pilot of the first plane to hit the North Tower, September 11th, 2001. Atta gave every sign that he thought he was going home that night to his discotheque, to his favorite prostitute, to his cocaine, and to his booze. All of that stuff going on. So in this case, we have these two people who seem to have a sort of normal middle-class life. He's got a job. They're going to get married. They're going to have a child or have one already. Doesn't that look like they thought they were actors in that drill, and then somehow the tables were turned and they get offed? Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So let's take a look at this once again. The hypothesis I have is that the two individuals now deceased. Originally it was three, huh? That's another giveaway, right? That there's a third shooter who has disappeared from the narrative after a couple of days, right? We've had that. But in this case, I say these are quite likely actors in a drill. In other words, they thought they were part of this active shooter exercise, which we have confirmed from the Victorville Valley News, as well as from National Public Radio. You can even hear the interview with the head of the SWAT team, who says we were drilling exactly what then happened. That's always a very disturbing sign in terms of the veracity. So their actions cannot be explained in terms of any normal motive of everyday life. And because of that, and because of the importance of this event, you've got to then look around and say, well, doesn't it look like they were, then these people were pawns of the intelligence agencies? And the obvious thing is, if the two of them, or if one of them comes to this Christmas party or whatever this gathering is, and then leaves, and then the two of them supposedly come back, how about the one guy goes home? At that point, dark forces, right, the rogue network, eliminate both of them, kill them, bring the bodies along, deposit them at the scene, and doubles do the shooting. Why not? Doubles, right? From Mohammed Merah to all sorts of other events, right? Doubles, doppelganger. So I think that's where you would have to work. So let us be extremely skepticism. Oh, and of course, the fact that this morning, right, dramatically between 10 and 11, that the woman had pledged allegiance to ISIS is finally found on Facebook. This I would not trust. This is an attempt to shore up a story which had caused more puzzlement than anything else. They want to direct it, right? They want to somehow get some hype going about ISIS. All right. The highway bill has gone through. 5 years, $300 billion plus. That's pathetic. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the U.S. infrastructure a D grade. This is barely enough to keep it at a D grade. It's enough to keep it maybe from going to F, but it's still going to be a D. The Tax Wall Street Party calls for the seizure of the Federal Reserve, a bill through Congress that says the Federal Reserve is now going to put out $5 trillion of 0% 100-year federal credit through the subcontractors who are the governors, mayors, county executives of the United States to rebuild the highway system, the railway system, the water systems, the electrical grid, and every other aspect of national infrastructure, ports and docks, you name it. We want $5 trillion for that. We want $1 trillion plus, probably up to about 1.3 or 1.4 at this point, to refinance on an emergency basis all student loans into the 0% category. Now, Madame Yellen has been opening her yap this week. She's already crowing that her stewardship is so great that we're going to be able to have higher interest rates thanks to her. Isn't that great? That she's proven how effective she can be. Unfortunately, The U.S. economy has been propped up since the world derivatives panic and Wall Street bankruptcies of 2008 by, first of all, stimulus, a $800 billion stimulus, a $400 to $500 billion supplemental. That kept things going from 08 to 09, 10, 11. We've had 3 rounds of QE. QE 1, quantitative easing 1, quantitative easing 2, quantitative easing 3. The problem with those, of course, is that those were support operations for bankrupt, kited, rotten, toxic derivatives to keep the zombie banks alive. Now, that's a terrible policy. The only thing worse than that is what the libertarian lunatics want, which is to drive the entire system into a panic bankruptcy, a deflationary crash. And they say, like Andrew Mellon, liquidate stocks, liquidate bonds, liquidate real estate, liquidate the farmer, liquidate labor, liquidate everything. Too bad if you died. So we used to have QE3, but now that has been over for 1 year, 1 year after the end of QE3. And then the other part of this three-legged stool keeping things going is a 0% interest rate. Now, when Yellen takes that away, things are going to get ugly. They're already getting ugly, right? The volatility of the stock market this week, I would say, is bad. This, on the whole, is a recipe for the Morgenthau New Deal recession imposed by Morgenthau, speaking for Wall Street, against the wishes of Franklin D. Roosevelt, because even then you had a factionalized government with Wall Street favoring one group over another. So if you have money in stocks, if you have money in bonds, I would, this weekend, take a very careful look at that. Is it time to take some profits? Is it time to diversify? Is it time to shift some of your assets into different asset categories? It may well be. So look at that. You got about 1 week before this Annie Oakley here is going to pull the trigger and quite possibly set off a panic. And if you're a third world economy, right, those places are going to be in bad shape. Because once the U.S. interest rates start going up, there's the giant sucking sound of all the hot money fleeing out of South Africa, Brazil, and all these other places. This may be one of the goals, right? They want to collapse those bubbles as we go. Now, let us shift briefly to the problem of fascism. This is now a highly relevant and timely issue. As you know, I have always regarded fascism as very much a live issue. And there are strong fascist tendencies in many parts of society, certainly in the Democratic Party, certainly in the Republican Party, even more. You remember 10 years ago, I was talking about neocon fascist madmen, the Wolfowitzes and Feiths and people like this, the Cheneys, the whole group of them. Those guys essentially do fit into these categories. So we need, however, to understand fascism in a broader sense. Now, this is a two-sided coin. The average American thinks of fascism and Nazism mainly in terms of Hitler, and this is mainly in terms of the persecution of the Jews, which, of course, was a very important feature of the Nazi regime. Now, ironically, this narrow view, in other words, forgetting all about the epistemology, the philosophy, other things that don't have to do with this specifically. Nevertheless, today, we've had the Paris events of November 13th. We've then had Donald Trump come out with what amounts to Nazi policies, fascist and indeed Nazi policies. He wants to shut down mosques, and the idea was lots of mosques. He wants to have a registry of everybody who's a Muslim, clearly unconstitutional. And he wants essentially to bar people from public office. These are all Nazi measures. And this has allowed people to understand what he's about. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So talking about fascism, the topic has always been a very timely one. And now Trump, with his post-November 13th, post-Paris ravings about what should happen to Muslims in the United States, has now made it even more à la page, right? More relevant to where we are right now. You have to understand that there is a structure to this, right? Trump says in most famous raving of the last 10 days, he says that people in Jersey City were dancing and celebrating when they saw the Twin Towers come down. Well, I'm afraid I don't see any evidence of that happening on the waterfront involving Muslims. What we do have, of course, are those Carl Cameron reports, which talk about a moving van company, presumably staffed by members of the Israeli Mossad, who were filming the event from a rooftop. And I think the origin of what this urban legend that Trump has is actually in those Carl Cameron reports. And those reports, those Israeli moving men dancing on the roof and filming it with some kind of a video setup, it is very likely that this is what he's referring to. But of course he can't face it in this sense. Now, the structure of this is what? He says, and by the way, those Israeli moving men, they went back to Israel. They were interviewed on Israeli TV. They were held in jail by the United States for some months. So they were observing it. Now, let's not go crazy over observing, right? Doing something is one thing. Making it happen, that's one thing. To observe it is quite another. And there's no doubt that the Israelis observed every angle of 9/11, right? They tracked the patsies, and they did all sorts of other things. However, what's the context? As I recall, you got about 25 countries around the world who say, after the fact, that they knew this was coming, and they tried to warn the U.S. So within secret intelligence circles, there was a fairly widespread awareness that something very big was about to happen, and the Israelis seem to have gone along with that. Let me just stress again, this does not prove that the Israelis did 9/11. No. It proved that they observed 9/11. Fine. That implies foreknowledge, but again, the foreknowledge was, according to 25 countries, not the monopoly of the Israelis. So now Trump says the Muslims were applauding and celebrating. Well, at the time this happened, and this is another angle that you should know, again, the Israelis put out an old film of some Palestinians celebrating when they were being given some free samples of candy or something. So that also quite dubious. But the main thing I would point to, the structure, the internal, emotional, epistemological structure of Trump, is that this is a great betrayal. It's a stab in the back. He says, we let them come over here, and what do? They applaud when the buildings come down. This is a fascist argument in terms of its structure, and I must compare it to the agitation of Hitler in 1920, 21, 22, 23. At this point in Hitler's career, the main theme was not anything to do primarily with the Jewish population of Germany or with other things that he took on later. It was the betrayal of the German army in November 1918. It is the so-called legend of the stab in the back, the Dolchstoßlegende. This was the centerpiece of Hitler's agitation in the early 1920s. And the argument was, the German army was never defeated in the field. It was unvanquished, and it could have turned around and won the war. But a group of traitors in Berlin, communists, socialists, liberals, Jews certainly come in at this point in Hitler's demagogy. And all of this is the substance of this stab-in-the-back legend. So what Trump is offering is a Nazi argument in terms of the internal structure. Now, as it turned out, Hitler's charge is false, just like Trump's. Trump's charge is false. Hitler's charge was also false. And we know this because we have this very interesting American journalist. His name is George Seldes. And he interviewed Field Marshal von Hindenburg, on paper, the absolute supreme commander of the entire German army. He was interviewed by Seldes right after these events. In other words, within a couple of months. Later on, Hindenburg would go on to essentially buy into the Hitler stab-in-the-back legend. But at this point, still under the shock of the events, Hindenburg says, yeah, we were defeated, and we were actually defeated by the U.S., the American Expeditionary Force, because They defeated us at Saint-Michel. There was the German salient at Saint-Michel. And then there was the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. And he says, as a result of the Meuse-Argonne, we were defeated. And I can confirm this and this is in an interview published by George Seldes. I can also confirm, if you read the biography of General Douglas MacArthur, you will find that MacArthur, with one or two people, was able to sneak in behind German lines and get himself to a position, a vantage point above the city of Metz, M-E-T-Z, Metz, or Metz, as the French, I think, say. And the idea was that at a certain point in the German retreat, they had left Metz totally undefended. MacArthur said, I could easily capture Metz, and at that point, the entire German Western Front would have its supply line cut, interesting parallels to other issues, cut the supply lines and the entire German front would collapse. Now, let's assume that General Pershing, the commander on the U.S. side, had the brains and the guts to accept MacArthur, which he did not do, hated MacArthur, lifelong. If the German army had been routed in chaos, if the German front had come down, that might have meant no Hitler, because if it's clear that you're defeated, right, if the defeat is absolutely beyond any doubt, then it's going to be hard to go with a stab in the back legend when you're obviously routed. So that might have made a big difference in world history. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing, the libertarians, right? The libertarians are now coming to terms with the absolute failure of their agitation as expressed through the Paul Tard family, right? The pallbearers, Ron Paul, Rand Paul. Rand Paul is now down to 2%. His latest attempt to get attention is to force the District of Columbia to embrace the gun laws that he wants, right? And the animus on some of the programs today against little Rand is great, right? He's going to be in trouble. He wants guns to be everywhere, but not in the buildings where he works. So he's being pilloried as a hypocrite, whatever you think about guns, yes, or guns, no. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is the libertarians now falling away from Rand Paul are now turning to Trump. And this involves a complete capitulation. It is the rotten ideology of libertarianism playing out its logic. And it is, obviously, libertarianism is a very unstable compound, and it can't really stay as itself. It's got to transmute into something else. So what we're seeing is people lining up to toady to Trump. And this is unfortunate. If we look at Trump, right, from the point of view of a libertarian, Trump says, as we've said, Muslims cheered on the rooftops. I'm sorry, that's a big lie. Trump says, we need more surveillance. We need a more powerful state for the purpose of surveillance. I don't see how libertarians can accept this. Bin Laden did 9/11. This also he needs strong government. And now they're saying that Ronald Reagan is the best, as Trump says, the best president. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Our program has come down to our last segment. So let's just say the problem with libertarianism and that kind of economics, I've always tried to point to the fact that, for example, German Chancellor Brüning destroyed the economy and the political system of Germany in the 2 years from 1930 to 1932. Brüning did not himself necessarily become a Nazi, but he made Nazi rule almost inevitable. In other words, he set the situation for the Nazis to take over. And I would venture to say that is the problem with libertarianism. It essentially, because of its radical austerity and its radical anti-institutional, anti-state orientation, it threatens a chaos which is then going to create some kind of an authoritarian solution. And what we're seeing is that individual libertarians are playing out this logic right now. So my advice to people who are libertarians, come to the Tax Wall Street Party. Follow me. We have the solutions. We don't give up on 9/11 truth. We don't give up on fighting the the rogue network, the secret government, invisible government, parallel government, deep state. We're very much attuned to those problems because we fight them day to day, as we can see. You're fighting them in, for example, trying to get a decent policy on Syria. So, again, don't join Trump. If you have integrity, come to the tax Wall Street party. Now, we've got the Pearl Harbor anniversary. I still have a manuscript here, which is unfinished. I was going to try to get this out for December 2011. And then, of course, a little something called the Arab Spring came along, and I spent much of that year in places like Libya and in Syria. So I still have that, and I would reassure people who are interested in that book that it will come. I'm just not quite able to say when at this point. But then again, let's look at what's involved. We know that, once again, the libertarians, right, the Stinets of the world, the Republicans, the reactionaries, the Chicago Tribune, the Roosevelt haters, the anti-New Deal right-wingers, all of them try to tell you that Franklin D. Roosevelt betrayed the U.S. forces. Well, this is absolute baloney. And remember, I posit a 3-level conspiracy. How about this? Of course, these are 3 rather separate, disparate conspiracies, although they do interlock. And again, I don't go looking for conspiracies, but you got to report them when you find them. The first point is that, the way do you understand Pearl Harbor? Compare Pearl Harbor, December 1941, to the most proximate similar event, and that is the fall of France in May, June 1940. The French officer corps was filled with pro-fascist, pro-Hitler, pro-Mussolini sentiments. The American officer corps was also shot through with Roosevelt hating and this idea that anything would be better than Roosevelt. That included Hitler. Certainly Mussolini would have been absolutely welcome to these people. So Kimmel and Short, the 2 commanders, are incompetent. And they're incompetent because they don't want a war against fascist Japan. And, of course, the main issue is really Hitler. They don't want the U.S. in war against Hitler. So they're incompetent. And they're incompetent because they don't order air reconnaissance and they don't send out the submarines and the destroyers and the light cruisers they have to create some kind of a perimeter of reconnaissance. They have no aircraft warning system. We'll get to this in a second. Secondly, Stimson. Colonel Henry Stimson, which the guy who's praised by the historian Klutznick, I think his name is. Stimson is the evil heart of the Wall Street banking establishment. My God. And as if Stimson weren't enough, he has 2 assistants, and they're literally known as the imps of Satan. The imps of Satan. John J. McCloy later on became the head of the whole Eastern Anglophile banking establishment. Robert Lovett, very influential, chose the entire disastrous Kennedy cabinet. Rusk, McNamara, these horrible, horrible people who brought you the Vietnam War and so forth. Those were chosen by Lovett. This was a terrible mistake by Kennedy. The goal of Stimson and the imps of Satan was to wreck the New Deal, to make sure that Roosevelt would not be able to carry out his threats to liquidate the British Empire, which had been delivered to Churchill in August of 1941, right, at the famous Atlantic Charter, where they meet on the 2 battleships on the coast of Newfoundland, I think it is. Stimson, McCloy, and Lovett want to make that impossible. And then we have Winston Churchill himself. The fact that the British had been able to break the Japanese JN-25 operational naval code, the one that had to do with military operations, where you could tell what the Japanese were going to do and when. This is the Rusbridger and Nave study. The U.S. had the purple code, the diplomatic code. That's fine, but the JN-25 is what you need, and the U.S. doesn't have it. So it's the interplay of these levels. The fascist or Roosevelt-hating, maybe better, Roosevelt-hating sympathies of Kimmel and Short, the determination by Stimson to get some disaster, and this is complicated also by McCloy and Lovett, and then Winston Churchill withholding the information, right? Not sharing it. And this is Lord Halifax never went to the White House late at night to tell Roosevelt what was happening. So here's the problem. If you're doing air defense in 1941, you are oriented towards one thing: the tremendous effort of the British to defeat the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain in September 1940. And what this revolved around was an aircraft warning system. Now, the aircraft warning systems had been pioneered by General Chennault in China. In order to do it his way, you had to have a politically sympathetic population, and he did. So therefore, he's kind of rooted in the people air defense system. But the way the British did it was, of course, the Dowding system, D-O-W-D-I-N-G. And this involved the chain home aircraft warning system, the radar systems, but then also ground observers, watchers along the coasts, and then bring it all together in a filter room, in a kind of a central point where all the information flowed together. And you've seen these films, I think, from the 1940s, where they're pushing these markers around on the map of southeast England. Now, if you want to defend Pearl Harbor, what you're going to need is to coordinate the naval aviation that you have with the Army aviation, the Army Air Force that you have. Now, I recommend a book. It's called Defenseless, Command Failure at Pearl Harbor, by John W. Lambert and Norman Polmar. Norman Polmar is a pretty establishment kind of naval historian. So the idea is that Kimmel and Short fail to realize that the overwhelming imperative is to set up a filter room, or as they were going to call it, the aircraft warning system. So they didn't appreciate this. They were not interested. They dawdled. And therefore, the Dowding system, which would have been the obvious place to start for anybody with a brain, this was not implemented. Let's just see. We had Dowding came to visit the United States. For example, in New York and Boston, this system of aircraft warning service, or filter room, as the British called it, this was implemented at New York and Boston. And Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, the architect of the British victory there, who had directed the Royal Air Force defenses in the Battle of Britain, inspected these U.S. centers and approved them. So the idea was that the U.S. Army-Navy Combine in Hawaii was supposed to set up the same thing, except that Kimmel and Short didn't give a damn. They were caught flat-footed. They did not prepare. They failed to send out aircraft, the PBY Catalinas. They failed to send the destroyers, the submarines, and the light cruisers, which mounted aircraft for reconnaissance on the back. So that's the Pearl Harbor story. And we'll see you next week on World Crisis Weekend.